if you have never experienced a high ropes course, I will tell you from experience that it is a heart-pounding, adrenaline-flooding, palm-sweating adventure perceived as high risk, purposefully designed to help participants push through their fears, face up to risks, and achieve goals that are difficult to describe or quantify, but very valuable. I had just been installed as head of staff at Faith Church in Baltimore, Maryland, when exactly 1 month into my tenure there, I was swept off to join one of the church's adult groups called the Fun Folk. Although, in my estimation, the name was a misnomer. I'll let you be the judge. We settled into a Presbyterian church camp out in rural western Pennsylvania, and on Saturday morning took part in some harmless group building activities. The afternoon was reserved for more menacing recreation. What fun! I, the newbie, was chosen by the group to go first. As pastor, I was to demonstrate my fearless sense of adventure, my willingness to defy risk and lead the way. After checking my harness, my ropes, and helmet, I began the climb. The first part was a cinch for me. I had grown up climbing trees, scaling the barn silo, and ascending bales of stacked hay to the top of the haymow. At the top of the first challenge, I hooked myself into the zip line, moved on to the rope walking challenge, and then to the swinging planks, and so on, until at last I reached the final aerial platform, some 40 to 50 feet above the ground. Picture the very top of your average mature South Carolina pecan tree, and you'll know how high up I was. A hunky young camp counselor waited for me there and offered me 2 options. I could choose to be lowered slowly and gently to the ground by way of the harness and line, or I could jump. The young man explained that if I wanted to try the jump, I should aim for the big boulder on the ground below us. He pointed to it, and I gulped in my breath. At the bottom of the free fall, he said, my harness would catch me and I would swing safely to and fro on the line until someone on the ground lowered me back to earth. It would be, in essence, a bungee jump. I looked down at my new parishioners, the Fun Folk, who were gazing up at me with bated breath. I felt I had no real choice. As I focused on that rock so far below me, I recalled the words of the pastoral nominating committee who had expressed a desire for a pastor who was a risk taker. On the edge of that platform, my fear was formidable. I tried to breathe deeply and concentrate on that rock. Just as I thought I was not going to be able to do it, the young man beside me whispered in a sweet and tender voice, "Sometimes it helps to think of a scripture passage." I immediately thought of, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from God's watchful eye." And with that, I threw off my fear and threw myself off that platform into thin air. There followed one of the most exhilarating experiences of my life. The feeling of falling and trusting that I would be caught at the bottom of my ark was life-altering. I felt utterly free and light as a sparrow caught up in a breeze. Then my fall was arrested by the line, and gravity asserted itself. Suddenly, I was 6 years old again, swinging back and forth high above the ground. When I finally looked back at my audience, I saw Ron Sperling, the chair of the Pastoral Nominating Committee, his eyes on fire and a wide grin on his face. He gave me a thumbs up. None of those who followed me on the course that day chose to take that same leap. Fear is one of the hallmark human emotions, and it is so often unavoidable. Fear of the unknown is one of our greatest shared fears. Uncertainty is frightening. Feelings of being out of control scare us. God knows we are living every day now in utter uncertainty and turbulence, lying down and rising up with fear. We fear change. We fear danger or damage to, or the loss of someone we love. We fear the death of loved ones, both parents and children. We fear in both directions. We fear illness. We fear losing our own lives. We fear the loss of security, the loss of a job, financial instability. History shows us that during times of national insecurity and vulnerability, people succumb to the voices of ethnic and religious bigotry and of fear-driven ideologies of exclusion, extremism, and violence. When people are afraid, they pull back or push away. They oppose change. They cling to the familiar and resist the unknown. Fear then becomes a painful habit of mind that demands some sort of remedy, some sort of cure, some sort of escape. The gospel writer Matthew offers counsel to members of the very early church, to those living under social, economic, political, and religious pressure. Jesus, through Matthew, both charges and encourages the church to face oppression without being paralyzed by fear. He assures his followers that they can certainly expect opposition, since he himself faced it. Shockingly, he offers them the example of being called Beelzebul, an Aramaic word and one of many names for the devil. Jesus makes the point here that his followers, when speaking and acting out truth, should anticipate name-calling and misrepresentation. Matthew reports Jesus addressing the issue of fear with his disciples as a lesson for the early church, but it is also a lesson for us today. The passage from this section of Matthew's Gospel is referred to as the missionary discourse. With it, Jesus sends his disciples out into the world to reveal that which has been hidden. They are to preach the good news, to be the good news, to proclaim it from the housetops. Jesus says the time has come for the truth to be made known. The hypocrisy of all the religious and political establishments will be unmasked with the proclamation of the gospel. The evil powers of the system that is unjust, unmerciful, corrupt, and oppressive will be exposed for what they are. And Jesus acknowledges that such a revelation will bring about persecution. What we have been seeing in our own country is a growing backlash against those who stand for truth, those who reveal truth. That which has been hidden are demonized and terrorized, losing their jobs, some even losing their lives. When a harmful and imperfect system is revealed for what it is, those in positions of power, those who have benefited for so long from its advantages, become fearful, feel threatened, and will lash out at anything, at anyone who challenges the status quo. Jesus, who spent his entire life breaking down social barriers, challenging social and political systems, proclaimed all people to be God's beloved children, and called all of us to commit to a God who transcends all nations, races, and genders. To disciples then and now, Jesus says, "What you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. The time has come for the truth to be made known. We must bear witness to the horrible deprivation brought about by the violence of patriarchy, racism, and authoritarianism. We can be silent no more. We can and must, despite our fear of retaliation, speak truth from the rooftops." I was 30 years old, and in my first called position as pastor of the 275-year-old Presbyterian Church of Dover in the historic capital of Delaware. It was a beautiful summer Saturday, and I was just about to close up church after officiating a wedding. The photographer was taking a few last shots of the bride and groom when someone who had been in the marriage ceremony came back in through the main entrance, declaring that the Ku Klux Klan had gathered in the center of town. In disbelief, I rushed out to the street, and there, half a block away, I saw men in army fatigues and white hoods holding up Confederate flags. I was stunned, I was scared, and I was outraged. I rushed to my office, disrobed, and hurriedly crafted a sign that read simply, "Love thy neighbor." I made a quick phone call to an elder in the church so that my congregation would know what I was up to. and sprinted with my sign to where hatred and racism had converged. I stood alone in silence with my sign as men, some in hoods, others with shaved heads and dressed in camouflage bearing swastika patches, angrily shouted at me and anyone else who happened to drive by. I will confess to you that I was terrified. I had never, ever imagined being in such a moment. White-knuckled, I held my pitiful sign and stood my ground for as long as those men occupied that intersection. I went home that afternoon and wrote a sermon depicting the experience and then delivered it the following morning. Willie Adams, a burly black man who gave the bass section of our church choir its backbone, greeted me after worship with tears streaming down his face. In my 75 years of life, he said softly, I have never heard anyone address the Klan from the pulpit until this morning. In that moment, I knew that despite the fear I had experienced, my actions, no matter how terribly inadequate the day before, and my words, no matter how ephemeral that morning, had begun to lift the lid off something that needed to be shouted from the rooftops. I had faced my own fear while at the same time bearing witness to the horrible depredations in our culture at large, stemming from and stoked by the fear and rage of a few. Conscientious objector Richard Steele, born to a Scottish farmer and a South African mother, was about to be jailed for refusing to serve in the South African Defense Force when he had to consider the possibility that he might be killed in prison. Later, in 1981, in an interview with the International Fellowship of Reconciliation report, Steele asked himself, was I prepared to die for what I believed in? I realized finally that I was, and this freed me of a tremendous anxiety. The power of fearlessness is astonishing. I think of those who were giving me orders. They were under a real tyranny and far more the victim of it than I was. When they were yelling their orders at me, I had a vivid image of these tiny creatures assaulting my feet, wanting to demolish me with orders, while I was way above, not on their level at all. They could threaten me with anything at all and not get me, because I wasn't afraid. This was immensely liberating to me. I could be the person I was without fearing them. They had no power over me. There is great power in being fearless. But even those of us who have not reached that level, tall pecan tree level, can face and embrace our fear, assured that God stands with us in the midst of our terror. My prayer for you, for all of us, is that we have the courage to move beyond our fears, that we might proclaim God's truth to a frightened and deceived world. As people of color are knelt upon, strung up, and shot down, as citizens kneel in our streets in their thousands in solidarity with the oppressed, and as we remain separated and distanced to protect one another and our valiant healthcare and essential workers, as we face down our fears of the unknown and of the known, a gentle voice yet whispers in our ears, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from God's watchful eye." God's eye is on the sparrow, my friends. Amen.